broadcasting from the studios of AM 950 KTNF, the progressive voice of Minnesota, and airing on WCPT 820, Chicago's progressive talk where facts matter. Welcome to The Gailey Show, the only daily LGBTQ news and talk show on the radio in the United States. I am your host, John Parker, also streaming on our YouTube channel. And if you like what we're doing, please subscribe and click that like button and let us know how you are enjoying the show. Okay, clearly a lot is happening right now in the world, and coming up after us is Democracy Now! On WCPT in Chicago. In Minneapolis, it's going to be the Matt McNeil Show. They're going to be breaking down all of the latest headlines and what is happening in the world, because clearly it is a lot. For us today, it is our weekly Unpack This For Me episode, where we do take a step back from the headlines and invite a special guest to really dive into their area of expertise, an issue that is affecting the LGBTQ and allied community. Unpack that for us. And today we're going to unpack a pretty big issue, U.S. national security. So my guest is Lucas F. Schleusener. Luke is a writer, educator, and national security strategist shaping the future of equity across the national security enterprise. As co-founder and CEO of Out in National Security, he leads a global community that advances LGBTQIA+ inclusion and drives policy change across defense and foreign policy. He has served as a speechwriter to 3 U.S. Secretaries of Defense. He worked in the Obama White House and on President Obama's original campaign. And in 2024 and 2025, Washingtonian magazine listed him as one of the 500 most influential people of Washington, D.C. Luke, it's great to see you again. Welcome to The Gailey Show.
John, it's great to see you again. I'm glad to be back. Glad to be here with all of your listeners and the community you've built here.
And in terms of see you again, for folks, you need to check out the episode we had with Luke just a couple weeks ago on This Queer Book Saved My Life. Had an amazing conversation with the historian John D'Amelio, based in Chicago, about Bayard Rustin. Very timely conversation of someone that we should be learning from right now. But national security, your area of expertise. So in our pre-show emails, I learned something that I did not know. So Luke, who is the largest employer of queer folks in the country and the single largest provider of queer healthcare in the United States? Because I did not know this, and it blew my mind. So who are those people?
Isn't this an amazing fact, John? So DoD directly employs 1 in every 100 Americans, which means that it is the single largest LGBTQ employer in the United States. About 250,000 of those, we think, are uniformed service members spread across the active duty component, the National Guard, which some of your listeners in Minneapolis and elsewhere have seen on the streets in recent weeks, and the Reserve, which is that 2 weeks a month, 1 week a year kind of a deal where you help pay for college. We think there's probably about 100,000 LGBT civil servants, and then a larger number of contractors. And then the largest care provider in this country for queer people is the United States Department of Veterans Affairs.
We're going to say Department of Defense, just to let that.
Sorry, thank you for the reminder that.
Well, no, we're not
use too many acronyms.
Other word that Hegseth likes to use for him fancy himself. So the Department of Defense is the largest queer employer of queer folks in the country, and the VA is the single largest provider of queer healthcare. So I imagine then, when they do something, it ripples out or probably waves out across the country?
Yes, it does. So, for example, when I was at the Pentagon, one of the cool things we got to do was we got to, in that window of time between Windsor and Obergefell, we got to recognize same-sex marriages by point of celebration rather than by point of current residence. So for every queer person who put on the uniform, that meant that if you got married in Illinois and you got sent to Georgia, North Carolina, Missouri, other states that had not yet recognized same-sex marriage, your marriage was treated the same as anyone else's. It also meant that we could, for the people who contract to provide a variety of services, we could enforce non-discrimination. And the other thing to keep in mind is the VA provides care to about 2 million people. It also trains north of 100,000 medical professionals a year. So decisions around who is included, who is treated well, and who is promoted not only shape the future of the nation's security, but shape the community at large, right? You're talking about 250,000 people, which is, that's a lot of healthcare, that's a lot of policy. And we are now 15 years past the end of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, the policy that prohibited open LGBT service or LGB service. And we're just at the point where there's about a dozen gay veterans running for Congress, which is the first time that's ever happened. It's always been, maybe one every other cycle. And now you have a transformational moment where people who have raised their right hand and served the country can continue to do so because of the changes that DoD has made in the past.
So I guess I do have a question. Is it because the Department of Defense is just such a huge enterprise?
Mm-hmm.
It's just by virtue of that they became the largest employer of queer folks in the country, or is there something specific to DoD as an employer? Because I think still, like, immediately when I think of armed services, when I think of Department of Defense, but there's so many civilian jobs right there as well. So how did that come to be?
So there are a couple of different things that we know. So like we know, for example, that 1 in 5 trans people will put on a uniform over the course of their lifetime, which is an extraordinarily high number. Like we are about to lose about 4,000 trans service members. We are in the process of losing those people right now, which is to say the federal government is spending at least $500 million to get rid of those people and find replacements for them after paying for them to be everything from welders and plumbers mates to flute players in the Navy band, or fighter pilots, or cybersecurity people. DoD ended up this way because plenty of minorities want to serve the country the same way lots of people do. We do not have good data on exactly how many and why queer people serve, but in an era where 7 out of 10 Americans can't serve in the U.S. military, we do know that gay men, lesbians, and trans people are far more likely to sign up, and then those people are more likely to, having served, go on to be civil servants either at DoD or at VA or elsewhere across the federal government.
Wow. See, I've hosted this show for a year now. I consider myself gay for pay. I had no idea what this any of this. This is absolutely fascinating to me. So can we talk about things that have been happening then over the past years? We have this institution, these 2 institutions that are providing jobs and healthcare to the queer community. And over the past year, we've been seeing attacks on employee resource groups, defunding queer benefits, gender affirming care restrictions, getting rid of books on bases. Can you give us sort of that high level view of what the Trump administration has been doing to the Department of Defense and the VA over the past year?
Sure. So, what the Trump administration has done is launched something that looks, like the second Lavender Scare. For your listeners who are a little on the younger side or may have only seen parts of Fellow Travelers, the sizzle reel as opposed to the political reel. The first Lavender Scare was a moral panic about queer people in the federal government and secrets in the 1950s. This Lavender Scare is about the fact that, in the last 25 years, queer people have integrated fully into the armed forces, into civil service. So, DoD and VA, you could not be openly gay in the armed forces and have a security clearance until after 2011. So, midway through Britney Spears' conservatorship is how I describe that.
What an interesting point.
It's helpful for folks who don't show up and read memos every day and don't want to go down a Wikipedia rabbit hole.
The thing is that so many queer people will know exactly when that was.
Right. Right. But like if you were out at the FBI or elsewhere since the mid 90s, you could be openly gay, have a clearance, all that stuff. And so what's happened in the last 25 years for queer people in the military in particular has been an end of formal structural discrimination and an acceleration of more and more people in and more people having boring, ordinary careers in the military, which is to say most people serve 3 to 5 years and move on in life. But that is upsetting for a lot of people who don't want to share, right? There are people who, when they imagine the U.S. military, like the current Secretary of Defense, it has to be about lethality. It has to be about manhood. It can't be about the fact that, something like 40% of the enlisted force is African-American, for example, or the fact that, 1 in 5 trans people will serve. It's unsettling to think that we are by 2030 going to have a force that is half female for some people. And so you have an organized set of political entrepreneurs and actors who are so upset that, people like us are in the public square, that people like us, in fact, keep the nation safe. The most recent head of the National Counterterrorism Center is a lesbian and a former decorated FBI agent, before the person who now has that job, for example. And they are trying to shove people back in the closet and out of the streets. And that means a couple of different things. It means the return of the trans ban, and they're pursuing that in an incredibly destructive way, where this time trans people getting kicked out are getting tagged quite often with the same discharge codes that we usually give people who desert the US military or on active duty sell national secrets to a foreign government, which are very bad things that trans people haven't done. They just happened to wake up one day, someone else was in charge, and instead of getting to play the flute in the Navy band, they are now trying to figure out where they're going to live. And underneath that, all the federal government cabinet agencies until January of last year had things called employee resource groups, where if you are, if you're the parent of a child with a disability, if you're Jewish, if you're Black, if you're Latino, you can congregate together at work and you can build community, find meaning, advocate for yourselves depending on how the rules of various agencies work. And you have a response that is, we don't want to see you at work and we want to tell you you don't belong. And so those 100,000 civil servants, the kids who are at the service academies, everyone else basically had to go into hiding, and now hangs out under the organization I lead out in national security. And then beyond that, the current administration has decided that federal health insurance plans don't have to cover gender affirming care. And is trying to find every possible nook and cranny to shove us back in the closet at a time where we are a key part of the nation's security.
We are talking with Luke Schleusener, who is co-founder and CEO of Out in National Security. I've got a lot of questions, and thank God we've got you for the rest of the hour, because we're going to unpack a lot of this. So we're going to have more with Luke when we come back. You can keep the conversation going on Blue Sky. We are at thegaleyshow.org on Blue Sky. Make use of that. There are a lot of folks who already do. I get some really fun direct messages on there. So you can keep that conversation going on Blue Sky. You're listening to The Gailey Show on AM 950 Radio and WCPT 820. Welcome back to The Gailey Show. I am John Parker. We are coming up on the bottom of the hour. This is our weekly episode we call Unpack This For Me, where we sit down with an expert guest to take a deep dive into an issue facing the LGBTQ and allied community. And today we're talking about national security. My guest is Luke Schleusener, who is co-founder and CEO of Out in National Security, and who was listed in Washingtonian Magazine's 500 most influential people of Washington, D.C. in 2024 and 2025. Luke, before the break, we were talking about how Department of Defense is the largest employer of queer folks in the country, and you were laying out all the various ways that the Trump administration, led by Pete Hegseth in Department of Defense, has been just obliterating all of the inclusion for queer folks and just trying to kick them out entirely. How then do you see that ripple effect? Have we seen the ripple effect of those decisions into the broader community? Because when something happens, when something happens in the largest employer, that's going to have ramifications throughout the country. Have we begun to see those ramifications yet?
Yeah. People who would otherwise plan to make a career are planning to leave sooner. As I've mentioned, we're losing 4,000 people for no particular reason other than, the current administration doesn't like them, which is not actually a reason to get rid of qualified service members. You may have seen the headline last year about people getting fired from the National Security Agency. But broadly, the climate of the U.S. military, which had been moving towards inclusion and, that thing we love, which is complete indifference to, different people, has turned sour. And many people I know who are, my age or slightly younger, so your young officers, your young enlisted people are taking an early departure rather than stick around. We also know that for people who get care through the VA has stopped upholding a variety of directives that were meant to make care non-discriminatory, to make it culturally competent, to make it inclusive. People are stopping using that care. That is an entitlement that they earned through service to the U.S. government and to the American people, and it is absurd and will cost. It'll cost us money, and those people's health outcomes get worse.
Mhm.
So what is happening is it hurts our community, but it also hurts the country as a whole, because qualified, capable people, whether or not they are, I know people who are naval aviators, tank drivers, cybersecurity officers, admin experts, are looking around and saying, they fired CQ Brown, who was chair of the Joint Chiefs and was the second ever African American. They fired Admiral Franchetti, who was the first woman to be chief of naval operations, and they fired Admiral Fagan. It is very clear that for some people, as long as you look like Pete Hegseth, the sky's the limit. If you don't look like Pete Hegseth, the limit's the sky. And so what had been since Leonard Matlovich came out in the 1970s, a 50-year-long fight to break a brass ceiling, which had been broken, has now been put back in place. And in particular, the U.S. military lifted its ban on women in combat positions in the last decade. And now that is also, it appears, coming to an end, or at least they're trying to reverse that policy, which means if you're a woman in the military, your career opportunities shrink. So people are not going to stick around, and people who are considering joining are not going to. So you are, cutting off your nose to spite your face, and you're cutting off, the nose 20 years from now, because there are people who should opt in, would opt in, but have better choices, because they're not going to get harassed about who they're married to. They're not going to have to lie at work. They're also not going to be, subject to discrimination if they go somewhere else.
Okay. In Trump 1.0, so much to unpack there. In Trump 1.0, courts basically said, no, you can't get rid of trans service members. It seems like the courts are kind of holding the line, but the Supreme Court's basically going to be like, yeah, you can do it. I mean, that's just, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm just sitting on the outside from my, journalism studio here in Minneapolis. How accurate is that?
Yeah, I'm happy to unpack that a little bit. What I would say is two things. There was litigation in the first term that essentially ran out the clock because COVID happened, a variety of other things happened. And during Trump 1, the then Secretary of Defense, General Mattis, constructed a policy where new trans people could not join the military, but people who are currently on active duty after a certain number of years were grandfathered in. So basically, there was sort of a stalling out, like a car that goes hydroplaning, it just stopped. This time around, there are 3 federal lawsuits, one here in DC, one in New Jersey, and one in Washington State. And for the people who are impact litigation plaintiffs, they are protected. And, through the good offices of ONS and other partners, people like service secretaries and others have commented on discrimination this time around, which is a unique difference. But the Supreme Court has intervened over the district courts and said, even though this litigation is ongoing, and even though the litigation is about whether or not trans people can serve, while the litigation is underway, trans people can be expelled, which was not the case last time. Which is to say, the people who are following the rules, following the law, got good lawyers, got subject matter experts, went to the district court, and are seeking to not be harmed this way, the Supreme Court has said you can in fact harm these people this way, so that by the time the Supreme Court rules on this, many, if not all of the people seeking protection will have been pushed out one way or another. So there's people who've chosen, rather to stay in and figure out what is going to happen, have opted to leave, take their retirement and go home, do other things with their lives. Some of those people, are running for a local office. Some of those people are doing other things, but it is much more harmful. And it raises real questions about what you do on the backside of this. And so, we have worked on legislation in the Congress and to educate the Congress in terms of, making trans service something that is in statute rather than in administrative law, which means that every time an administration changes, your trans friends will still be able to become an accomplished flautist or, cook or, do cyber stuff, right? Instead of like every 4 years, it could be Calvin ball. But it is worse this time because it seems like, they are sensing an opportunity to go for broke and are really trying to go as far as they can.
I'm here with Luke Schleusener, co-founder and CEO of Out in National Security, who just dropped an epic Calvin and Hobbes reference, Calvin Ball. Okay, so does this mean, I've got just about 90 seconds left here before I have to hit a break. When the Supreme Court says that and says, go ahead, fire people, kick them out, and we'll decide later, is that basically them saying this is how we're going to rule?
I try not to read the mind of the Supreme Court, and if I could, I would probably also, make money gambling. I would suspect that broadly they're going to permit this to go forward, right? So, like, by the time it gets to the Supreme Court, they'll say something to the effect of, either this is a national security issue and the Supreme Court will not intervene, or the executive gets to decide, or any number of other things. Like, there's a very famous older Supreme Court decision called Rosker v. Goldberg, where men sued to force women to get into the draft, and the Supreme Court simply said, the executive gets to decide who qualifies for military readiness and who doesn't. You don't have a constitutional right. It might be that, it might be something else, but there are going to be very interesting questions, because by the time the Supreme Court rules, everyone's going to get kicked out, and they're going to try to kick people out by reading their medical records.
Oh. Okay, we're going to have more with Luke Schleusener, co-founder and CEO of Out in National Security, when we come back. You are listening to The Gailey Show on AM 950 Radio, the progressive voice of Minnesota, and WCPT 820, Chicago's Progressive Talk. Coming to you from the studios of AM 950, KTNF, the progressive voice of Minnesota, and airing on WCPT 820, Chicago's Progressive Talk, where facts matter. Welcome back to The Gailey Show. I'm John Parker. It is 33 minutes after the hour, also streaming on our YouTube channel. Please click subscribe there and leave us a comment on how you like we're doing this show today, how this show is going today. Folks, there's so much going on. I can't even talk anymore. And this is literally my job. It is our weekly Unpack This For Me episode. This is where an expert guest joins us for the hour to unpack a particular issue affecting the LGBTQ and allied community. Our guest is unpacking for us today U.S. national security. Our guest is Lucas F. Schleusener. Luke is a writer, educator, and national security strategist shaping the future of equity across the national security enterprise. As co-founder and CEO of Out in National Security, he leads a global community that advances LGBTQIA+ inclusion and drives policy change across defense and foreign policy. Okay, so we've talked about DoD and their role as the largest employer of queer folks in the country, the VA being the largest provider of queer healthcare in the country. Before the break, we were talking about the Lavender Scare 2.0 and how they're basically going to succeed in kicking out trans people, and the Supreme Court's just going to go along with that. So let's turn to how our allies are looking at us right now. One story that we could do that through is the Five Eyes. Another is through the UK. So they actually have been doing a review of what they did to their LGBTQ veterans and how they were treating them and restitution for that. So talk to me about how our allies are looking at us right now. And I mean, is it completely slack-jawed, or are we getting to a point now, like with Greenland, where they're sort of going, you know what, have fun. We're kind of going to find ways to not have to deal with you anymore.
I mean, it's mortifying, right? Like it's embarrassing. Like we were at least a stable post-war democracy, and we have close relations with all of our NATO partners. Like 40 Danes died in Afghanistan, which is about as many people proportionally to the Danish population and the Greenlander population as Americans died in Afghanistan. But in the last year now, because it's been a year and I guess 10 days, I'm bad at math. We've seen different NATO partners stop different kinds of intelligence sharing with us, which is disconcerting. And the Five Eyes, so for your listeners, the Five Eyes are the US, UK, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. That is the closest and most interoperable set of partners the US has in the world, in part because We share a common language and a common history, if not common law. But to give a sort of an example of that, on 9/11, in between the first and second wave of attacks when the Pentagon had been struck, but it was unclear if it was over, Michael Hayden called up his counterpart in the UK and explained that were US intelligence headquarters to be destroyed in the next wave of attacks, they would transmit control of all US intelligence to GCHQ, which is the Signals Intelligence Agency in the UK. That is how close we are. We are a very, very tight universe of people. And these are the people who went into Afghanistan with us, they went into Iraq with us. And the President of the United States has, in the last year, promulgated a policy and sort of shared images, I think, on Truth Social and elsewhere, of annexing Canada, of annexing Greenland, maybe Venezuela, maybe Cuba, maybe anything. And Canada's woven in very tightly with us, and we're very lucky to have them as a neighbor and as friends. One of the reasons we are better off is that we have a tight free trade relationship with both them and Mexico, and also they've been a quiet northern border of ours for over 100 years. The idea of lighting that on fire because if you look at a map, it looks big, and so you should grab it, is a bad idea. And through my time at DoD and through my time as head of ONS, I know plenty of representatives across the Five Eyes who are just sort of slack-jawed and concerned as to what is happening. And I like to tell them that the last year has been a little bit like being a dog locked in a hot car waiting to be let out again. And hopefully that'll happen, or I will have to figure out how to open the door myself. Mm-hmm. When it comes to our partners on the other issue, on LGBT issues, what is interesting is that all of our partners lifted their bans on queer people in their uniformed services ahead of us. Canada lifted their ban in 1989 due to litigation. The UK lifted theirs in 2000. And in the last 15 years, both of those countries have gone to considerable lengths to understand what they did when they harmed their citizens through their version of the Lavender Scare and various bans, and to make compensation. So in the UK, they just finished an independent review. Their Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, apologized. Their Minister of Defense apologized. There are mechanisms for people who were harmed by the ban on, explicitly the ban on the military folks, to get their pensions back, to get their medals back. This past November, which is sort of the memorial month for the UK because of World War I, mm-hmm. The King Charles III, went to the unveiling of a memorial to the people who were victimized by their government. So it is a sea change in how they see that. And that's 25 years after the end of their ban.
And to clarify for folks, that Prime Minister Sunak was a conservative.
Yes,
not a
correct.
liberal.
Correct.
Put that in context for folks.
Yep. No, context is important. Yeah, he was a Tory, as was the then Minister of Defense. And in Canada, there was a sequence where a woman named Michelle Douglas sued and got their ban overturned, and then she and other people who'd been victimized went back and sued again during when Justin Trudeau was Prime Minister. And Canada now has this fabulous thing called the Purge Fund, whose job is to go find everyone victimized by their version of the Lavender Scare, arrange compensation, engage in public education. So now Canada has to have age-appropriate elementary education on their Lavender Scare. And they get a monument on their version of the National Mall. They also, in their National Human Rights Museum, they have an exhibit called Love in a Dangerous Time, which collects primary source material of the Canadian government, unleashing their version of the FBI, unleashing their own security services on their own citizens to hunt down gays and lesbians. And I was lucky enough to go up last October for the unveiling of that museum exhibit, which is now going to travel that country.
Wow.
And I'm very grateful that senior defense officials, senior government officials, but also senior LGBT advocates across the Five Eyes, look at us, still want to talk to us about this, and are offering their advice on lessons learned on what it takes to do redress, compensation, and clean up after doing something really horrible to people who just want to serve their country.
My guest this hour is Luke Schleusener, co-founder and CEO of Out in National Security. I don't know, because I'm not a national security expert. You are. Is there a red line where you could see other members of Five Eyes, other NATO members going, yeah, no, we're cutting you off. You're not getting any more intelligence. You're not getting stuff from us anymore.
Some NATO members already have. So the Dutch have, lots of NATO members have noticed that stuff they were sharing with the US intelligence community through pre-existing agreements, long habit, whatever, were showing up in Russian intelligence. So they've suspended things. So that's one case example already. I know, we have a lot of signals intelligence and other sharing that started to get suspended when the US Navy and other assets were being used to drone ships in the Caribbean. And when there was the most recent, I guess, Greenland invasion scare, which sounds like something out of a B movie, the French were very clearly considering, forward deploying assets. Like basically, it was going to break NATO in half to have one NATO member go to war with a bunch of other NATO members to annex a country that did not want to be annexed. The pretty much every Nordic military and the Nordic parts of NATO are also fabulous allies who should be, much loved by us because they spent a lot of blood and treasure in Afghanistan and are also just good neighbors to have. Put forward assets into Greenland, like something completely insane. And it's hard to explain how bad the damage is to sort of the constellation of relationships that make the world a better place for America and Americans. You can perhaps consider that the Europeans are annoying for whatever reason, but the intelligence sharing, the security cooperation created more democracies, more free markets, more security than anything else in human history. And before that rolled up, we had 2 different world wars where people could not get it together, and reverting to that interwar period where everyone's security dilemma is their problem and no one else's is going to be really scary, but also really expensive. I'm sure your listeners have noticed they've probably spent a lot more money in the last year on everything from jeans to avocados to shoes from Vietnam. And if we keep mistreating our NATO partners, same thing. And it'll accelerate. Like lots of NATO partners have discussed, because they are aware, getting off of Microsoft Office or Google Suite because they assume, rightly or wrongly, that the American intelligence services are now hostile players and will exploit those tools against them. And that's bad. Like bad for US technology hegemony, but also just bad to imagine a more and more fragmented landscape where our closest friends can't trust us anymore, and rightfully so. And all for more failed real estate deals for people who don't understand how the world works but just want to grab. It's ugly.
How far does this need to go before it's no longer a once Trump gets out of office, everything reverts back? Like, is there a point where the rubber band gets stretched too far that even when he's gone, the whole MAGA apparatus is still going to be there? There are still going to be 40% of this country that are dyed-in-the-wool red hats. At what point is there a point where this just goes too far and the damage becomes irreparable?
I mean, I think for a lot of partners, they could see the first election as an inside straight, a statistical aberration, whatever. The return is scary, right? Because not only do you have an administration that is interested in cutting deals, but cutting deals that favor people that it thinks of as ideological fellow travelers. So whether or not that's Vladimir Putin in Russia, or you may have seen some of the reporting about repositioning State Department assets to support hard right parties in Europe, like Marine Le Pen, who, if your listeners don't know, runs a neo-fascist party in France that is fully subsidized by Vladimir Putin, and on and on. Like these are people who, okay, if this is how America is going to operate in the world now, whatever you can say about the next administration, whoever that is, or alternating administrations, you suddenly face a scenario where, there is a statistical likelihood for many people planning in the world that America will be unreliable, depending on which party's in power, right? You can't pretend that this was an aberration. This is just a manifestation of policy preferences. And that means everyone has to, cover their own interests, which, is completely understandable and is risk management and risk mitigation, but it's bad for the world because if everyone is playing defensively, you have a smaller pie for everyone. And it'll be interesting to see, whoever the successor is of the Trump administration, especially if it's not the same party, how, the family of nations and sort of the architecture that we built post-war. So, World War II ends, the US built, global free trade. We built the World Bank and the IMF and all this other stuff that undergirds a really remarkable expansion of democracy, but also the bottom half of the world has gotten less poor, not only since the end of World War II, but especially since the end of the Cold War. And all of that machinery does include hypocrisies, does include compromises, but blowing that machinery up in a fit of pique is going to be incredibly expensive, and it's going to have an incredibly long tail. For the same reason that detaining foreign nationals who are here on legal visas is going to have negative ramifications.
Mm-hmm. My guest is Luke Schleusener, co-founder and CEO of Now Out in National Security. And I'm a dual citizen of France and the US, so very aware of Marie Le Pen and her National Front Party. And there was actually a bombshell interview that came out last week from one of the judges that was in her case. She was found guilty of embezzling money when she was a member of the European Parliament. She's been banned from running for office for 5 years, but apparently the Trump administration intervened with this judge who was freaked her out. She had to make official reports to the French intelligence and the French foreign ministry, look what they're doing. This is insane. Okay, we're gonna have more with Luke when we come back. You are listening to The Gailey Show. One quick break and more from us. Welcome back to The Gailey Show. I am John Parker. We are coming up on the top of the hour. It is our weekly Unpack This For Me episode, and our guest this week is unpacking national security for us. That guest is Luke Schleusener, who is co-founder and CEO of Out in National Security. He has written for Foreign Policy, Defense One, and The Hill, among others. Recognizing the scope of his work in 2023, West Point awarded him their Knights Out Leadership Award. Luke, I'm not one of those journalists that's give us all the hope, because I think that's really Pollyanna-ish. But I do want to talk about things that we can do to action items. We need action items. And so One of those is the Fit to Serve Act. Tell us what that is and the current status of it.
Sure. I mean, I'll give you an overview of some really cool action items that include not only Fit to Serve, but a couple other things we're doing. So Fit to Serve is a federal bill introduced by Senator Warren, who's the subcommittee chair on Senate Armed Services for Personnel. So she's the right person to run the ball there. And then Sarah Jacobs in the House. So every bill in Congress needs someone in the House and the Senate to run the ball. And the deal there is that instead of having trans service flick off and on, depending on who's in power, it would be passed into statute. This is a little bit similar to the way Don't Ask, Don't Tell ended. And that's very important. Another thing to give listeners hope is the administration cannot unilaterally end LGB military service. They would have to pass an act of Congress. Now, they can make things miserable for people who are serving, but they can't stop us from putting on the uniform. And this would do the same thing for trans people. Depending on which version of the bill gets passed, we will also have a path back to service for all the people who get kicked out. Now, those 4,000 people may not all want to come back in 2029 or 2033 or whenever this passes into law, but it's important that we treat those people with dignity. So that is one flagship item. Mark Takano is leading a bill with Richard Blumenthal in the Senate that could shape the road towards America's version of the LGBTQ Purge Fund. So we could be talking about something in the next couple of years that would give back to all the people who were targeted and harassed by the Lavender Scare, both the first one and the second one, and that would be great. And then drilling down a little further, ONS has had the opportunity to work with about 50 different partner civil society organizations in 16 states on a thing called the Transgender Service Toolkit. And for the 4,000 people who are getting out, but also the 150,000 trans veterans across the country, state and local government is now taking actions and taking steps to attract those people to those states and to protect them. Veterans, when they leave the military, are far more likely to volunteer, to run for local office, to make their communities better. And just this next week, California will be introducing a signature piece of toolkit legislation, which should include housing for LGBT vets. This would open veterans housing for the first time in double-digit numbers anywhere in the country. So those are all things to fight for, and those are all things to hope for. The other thing I would say that makes me mildly optimistic is that across Congress, but in particular on the House, the Senate and House committees for the armed services, which oversee, again, America's largest queer employer, there are more queer people on those panels than ever, and more people on those panels are more aligned with the Equality Caucus, which believes that queer people should be treated well in America. Mm-hmm. And by well, I mean like everyone else. So if your folks want to get involved and stay involved, they can pop on to our website and pull up the Transgender Veterans Toolkit, and they can call state and local government and ask for things to be done by their executive, for bills to be passed by their legislature, or they can ask their congressman to become a co-sponsor of the Fit to Serve Act or of Mark Takano's Truth and Reconciliation Bill.
Okay. There we go. And that website is going to be outinnationalsecurity.org. There's also another thing that we get here on the show is about accountability in terms of all of the illegalities that are being perpetrated by the Trump administration and seemingly all areas of leadership. One of those, I mean, one of the most egregious, I think, is the bombings of boats in the Caribbean and off the coast of Venezuela. How do you see from your perch, do you see that level of accountability happening post this administration where there'll be investigations and people held accountable that we're making, not just for the boat bombing, just generally speaking in the DOD?
It will very much depend on how this ends, right? I mean, you could tell multiple stories about what you would like to have happen, what should happen from a moral and ethical standpoint, and what will happen. I mean, it was interesting to see now some months ago when Congress amended the National Defense Authorization Act and clipped the Secretary of Defense's travel budget if he did not come forth and discharge documents related to the strikes on the boats. I will note there was another strike on a boat, I believe, this week. So, you know, it's a concerning pattern of behavior, and depending on congressional majorities and political pressure, you can see accountability. It will also depend on, you know, how many other things we have to do accountability for. It's a little bit like when Mr. Burns goes to the doctor in The Simpsons and his doctor explains he's not dead because all the germs are trying to get through the door at the same time. And so, you know, it may be a scenario like that, and you have to, you know, sit down and think about which things you'll demand accountability for and which you will not. You know, for example, much more in my lane, the administration has been pretty vociferous in directing to military record boards rules for how they're going to kick out trans people. And those documents are publicly visible. We have those documents because they are online. And those documents are giving what are manifestly questionable orders. And there will be accountability for that sort of thing. Accountability for other things will depend on whether or not Congress decides to press the button. And, you know, it'll depend on who you elect this fall and fall 2028.
The organization is Out in National Security. You can connect with all of their work at outinnationalsecurity.org. Luke, thank you so much for your time today. I still have a bunch of questions here, so maybe we'll have to have you back later in the year because it seems like something's coming out every year with this administration, every month rather, every day. So, but for right now, thank you for your time. This has been really very special. Thank you.
John, thank you so much. Always a pleasure to join you and your listeners, and I look forward to seeing you again when circumstances warrant that.
Perfect. All right. Thank you, everyone, for listening today. Up next on WCPT 820, Democracy Now! In Minneapolis on AM 950, it is the Matt McNeil Show. Stay tuned after that for Native Roots Radio. And then at 10 p.m. Central, Step into the Unknown with Greg Bakken on Ghost Box Radio. And until this time tomorrow, keep it queer, America.